The fear of loss is not a surface emotion. It does not originate in logic, nor does it obey reason. It emerges from a deeper psychological layer where instinct, memory, and identity intersect. When loss becomes possible, the unconscious is stirred into motion, and forces long kept dormant begin to assert themselves. This is why people often behave in ways that surprise even themselves. When something or someone they value is at risk of disappearing, under ordinary circumstances, much of human behavior is governed by the ego, the conscious structure that organizes daily life, social roles, and self-image. The ego prefers predictability. It maintains composure, control, and consistency. But the ego is fragile when confronted with the possibility of loss. When something essential is threatened, the ego's authority weakens, and the unconscious rises to compensate. Loss is perceived by the psyche not merely as an external event, but as an internal collapse. To lose someone is often experienced as losing a part of oneself. Attachments are not just emotional bonds, they are psychological investments. We unconsciously place parts of our identity, stability, and self-worth into people, roles, and relationships. When those anchors are endangered, the unconscious reacts as if survival itself is at stake. The unconscious does not speak in measured thoughts or polite language. It communicates through impulses, urges, dreams, sudden emotions, and compulsive actions. This is why fear of loss produces intensity. It bypasses rational planning and moves directly into action. People say things they have never said before. They act against their own stated values. They pursue, withdraw, confess, sabotage, or cling without fully understanding why. What activates in these moments is not necessarily love, but attachment fused with fear. The unconscious is less concerned with morality or long-term consequences than with restoring equilibrium. Its goal is to prevent psychic disintegration. If a person unconsciously believes that losing someone will expose emptiness, abandonment wounds, or unresolved trauma, the psyche mobilizes defenses to avoid that exposure. This is why fear of loss often resurrects old patterns. Childhood fears, unmet needs, and unhealed attachments resurface. A person who once learned that love was conditional may panic at withdrawal. Someone who associated abandonment with shame may suddenly become possessive or desperate. The present situation activates the past, and the unconscious reacts as though time has collapsed. The fear of loss also weakens repression. Traits that were carefully hidden, jealousy, dependency, vulnerability, rage, longing, begin to emerge. This is not a sudden change in personality. It is a revelation. The unconscious has always contained these elements, but they were kept in the background as long as stability was maintained. Threat removes the need for disguise. Interestingly, fear of loss can produce both constructive and destructive outcomes. In some cases, it forces self-awareness. The individual recognizes what truly matters and confronts what they have neglected. In other cases, it leads to manipulation, control, or self-betrayal. The unconscious does not distinguish between growth and avoidance. It simply seeks relief from anxiety. This explains why promises made under the fear of loss often feel intense but unstable. They arise from urgency rather than integration. When the threat subsides, the unconscious retreats and the ego resumes control, often without having truly transformed. What appeared as sudden clarity may dissolve once safety is restored. The fear of loss also reveals the difference between attachment and connection. Connection allows separation without collapse. Attachment interprets separation as annihilation. When the unconscious is activated by fear, it becomes clear whether a bond was built on mutual presence or psychological dependence. Perhaps most importantly, the fear of loss exposes where a person has placed their sense of meaning. If meaning is internal, loss is painful but survivable. If meaning has been outsourced, loss feels catastrophic. The unconscious reacts accordingly, intensifying behavior in an attempt to reclaim what was never fully owned internally. In this way, fear becomes a psychological messenger. It points toward unresolved wounds, unclaimed inner resources, and unconscious dependencies. It shows what has been avoided, postponed, or projected onto others. The unconscious does not activate without reason, and loss is one of the few experiences powerful enough to summon it fully into awareness. The ego is built to manage the visible world. It organizes identity, maintains consistency, and presents a coherent self to others. Through the ego, a person learns how to behave, what to suppress, and how to remain acceptable within social structures. Control is its primary function, but this control is conditional, and it depends on emotional safety. When emotional risk becomes real, the ego's authority weakens, and its carefully maintained structure begins to fracture. Emotional risk is not the same as emotional discomfort. Discomfort can be rationalized, minimized, or postponed. Risk, however, threatens the ego's core narrative. It challenges the stories a person tells themselves about who they are, what they deserve, and how secure their world truly is. When something deeply meaningful is placed in jeopardy, the ego no longer has sufficient defenses to maintain order. The ego survives through predictability. It relies on routines, roles, and expectations. Emotional risk introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty destabilizes control. When someone faces the possibility of rejection, abandon, exposure, or loss, the ego is forced into a defensive position. It can no longer operate smoothly because the situation exceeds its capacity to regulate emotion through logic alone. In moments of emotional risk, people often notice a sudden shift in behavior. Someone who was once reserved becomes expressive. Someone who appeared confident becomes anxious. Someone who insisted on independence begins to seek reassurance. These shifts are not contradictions. They are signs of ego collapse. The persona that once held everything together can no longer withstand the emotional pressure being applied. The ego attempts to regain control through familiar strategies. It may intellectualize the situation, assign blame, or minimize the importance of what is at stake. But when these strategies fail, the ego loses its grip. At this point, unconscious material begins to surface. Impulses, fears, and desires that were previously restrained move into awareness and behavior. Emotional risk exposes the ego's dependence on external validation. Many identities are built around being chosen, admired, or needed. When that validation is threatened, the ego experiences destabilization. It must confront the possibility that its value is not guaranteed. This confrontation is deeply unsettling and often triggers reactions that appear irrational or exaggerated. Control collapses most dramatically when emotional risk intersects with attachment. Attachments form around safety, meaning, and belonging. When an attachment is threatened, the ego interprets the situation as a loss of stability. The mind may understand that survival is not at risk, but the psyche reacts as though it is. This mismatch between conscious understanding and unconscious response is where collapse occurs. As control weakens, emotional intensity increases. People may feel overwhelmed by sensations they cannot name or regulate. Anxiety, urgency, and compulsion replace restraint. Decisions are made quickly, sometimes desperately, not because they are well considered, but because the ego can no longer tolerate the tension of uncertainty. This collapse often reveals how much energy was spent maintaining control in the first place. The effort to appear unaffected, strong, or self-sufficient. T requires constant suppression of vulnerability. Emotional risk removes the possibility of suppression. What has been held down emerges not gradually, but forcefully, creating the impression of sudden change. The ego's collapse under emotional risk can be humiliating. Individuals may feel exposed or ashamed by their reactions, especially if they conflict with their self-image. The desire to appear composed is replaced by the need to feel safe. This shift highlights the ego's limitations and the deeper forces that govern human behavior. Yet this collapse is not inherently destructive. It can serve as a moment of truth. When control fails, authenticity becomes unavoidable. The individual is confronted with their actual needs rather than their preferred identity. This confrontation can lead to growth if it is reflected upon rather than denied. Emotional risk strips away the illusion of mastery. It shows that control is not absolute and that vulnerability is not a flaw but a condition of attachment. The ego resists this realization because it threatens autonomy and pride. But resistance only intensifies collapse. Ultimately, emotional risk reveals that the ego was never meant to dominate the psyche entirely. It is a mediator, not a ruler. When it tries to maintain control in situations that demand emotional presence, it fractures under the weight of its own limitations, allowing deeper psychological truths to surface and reshape behavior. The shadow emerges where language collapses. It is not born from intention but from avoidance. Whenever a person cannot speak their truth, cannot admit their desire, or cannot tolerate their own contradiction, the shadow begins to mow. It operates in silence, filling the space left by unspoken feelings and unresolved tension. What cannot be articulated consciously is enacted unconsciously. Words are tools of the ego. Through language, the ego explains, justifies, and maintains coherence. Speaking allows a person to regulate emotion and make sense of inner experience. But when emotion becomes too threatening to name, words lose their function. At that point, the psyche does not remain passive. It finds another route of expression, and that route is action. The shadow is composed of traits, impulses, and emotions that the conscious mind rejects. These rejected elements are not eliminated, they are merely pushed out of awareness. Over time, they accumulate energy. When words fail, when the ego can no longer explain or contain what is happening internally, the shadow releases that energy through behavior. This is why people often act in ways they later struggle to explain. The behavior feels automatic, impulsive, or out of character. It is not that the person suddenly became someone else. It is that the part of them that was never given a voice has taken control. The shadow does not seek permission. It seeks expression. Silence plays a crucial role in this process. Silence between people, silence within oneself, and silence around difficult truths all feed the shadow. When someone avoids a necessary conversation, suppresses resentment, or denies longing, the tension does not disappear. It intensifies. Eventually, that tension demands release, and it finds it through action rather than speech. The shadow acts most strongly when vulnerability feels unsafe. If admitting fear threatens pride, the shadow may express itself through anger. If confessing love feels humiliating, the shadow may act through jealousy or control. If acknowledging grief feels overwhelming, the shadow may manifest as numbness or withdrawal. The behavior appears indirect because the truth behind it feels intolerable. This dynamic is especially visible in relationships. When people cannot articulate their needs, they begin to test, provoke, or sabotage. They create situations that force reactions instead of initiating honest dialogue. The shadow prefers drama over disclosure because drama allows expression without exposure. It moves the emotional burden outward onto others rather than inward towards self-awareness. The shadow also thrives on contradiction. A person may consciously believe they are generous, calm, or detached, while unconsciously harboring envy, resentment, or dependency. As long as these contradictions remain unacknowledged, they build pressure. When words fail to integrate opposing traits, the shadow enacts them in distorted ways. Importantly, the shadow does not act with moral awareness. It is indifferent to consequences. Its purpose is not harmony, but release. This is why shadow-driven behavior often feels excessive. It overshoots the original emotion because it carries the weight of everything that was previously suppressed. Attempts to control the shadow through force only strengthen it. Suppression increases its intensity. Denial gives it more autonomy. The only thing that weakens the shadow is recognition. When a person finds the courage to name what they feel, the need for enactment diminishes. Language restores mediation between impulse and action. However, naming the e-shadow is difficult because it challenges identity. Admitting jealousy contradicts the self-image of generosity. Acknowledging dependency contradicts independence. Speaking these truths feels like a loss of self, even though it is actually an expansion of self-awareness. The shadow acts not because it is malicious, but because it is unheard. It is the psyche's last attempt to restore balance when conscious communication fails. Its actions are symbolic expressions of unmet needs and denied emotions. What appears destructive on the surface is often a distorted plea for integration. When words finally return, when a person can say what they fear, want, or regret, the shadow loses its urgency. It no longer needs to act because it has been invited into awareness. Until then, it continues to speak through behavior, forcing acknowledgement through consequences rather than conversation. Love is often imagined as harmony, ease, and emotional safety. Yet this image belongs more to fantasy than to psychological reality. Comfort soothes, but it does not transform. Love, in its deepest form, does not simply affirm what already exists. It unsettles it. It disrupts routines, challenges self-concepts, and exposes vulnerabilities that were previously hidden beneath stability. When love enters the psyche, it rarely does so quietly. Disruption occurs because love threatens the structures the ego relies on for control. To love is to risk being seen, affected, and changed. This risk destabilizes familiar defenses. Emotional patterns that once functioned smoothly are interrupted, forcing a reorganization of inner life. Comfort maintains equilibrium. Love demands reconfiguration. In comforter, daily attachments, individuals can remain largely unchanged. Roles are established, expectations become predictable, and interaction follows familiar rhythms. These relationships may feel safe, but they often leave deeper layers of the psyche untouched. Love, by contrast, reaches into areas that comfort avoids. It activates unresolved wounds, unexamined fears, and long-buried desires, not as punishment, but as invitation. Disruption is the psyche's response to significance. When something truly matters, neutrality becomes impossible. Love magnifies awareness. It brings clarity to what was once tolerated, ignored, or postponed. Habits that seemed harmless are suddenly questioned. Emotional patterns that went unnoticed become impossible to ignore. This is not chaos for its own sake, but a signal that something essential is at stake. Love disrupts because it reveals dependency. Even the most independent identity must confront the fact that attachment creates vulnerability. This confrontation is uncomfortable. The ego resists acknowledging how deeply another person matters because doing so threatens autonomy. Yet this resistance is precisely where love exerts pressure, dissolving illusions of self-sufficiency. The discomfort of love often manifests as inner conflict. Desire clashes with fear. Longing collides with self-protection. The psyche oscillates between closeness and withdrawal, certainty and doubt. Turbulence is not a failure of love, it is evidence of its depth. Shallow connections do not provoke such tension because they do not reach the core of identity. Comfort seeks preservation. Love seeks truth. Preservation maintains existing patterns. Truth exposes where those patterns no longer serve growth. When love is present, complacency becomes difficult. The individual is confronted with parts of themselves that were previously hidden by routine. In this way, love functions as a mirror, reflecting both potential and limitation. Disruption also reveals love through behavior rather than intention. When someone is emotionally invested, their actions change, priorities shift, boundaries are tested, the psyche reorganizes around what it values. This reorganization often appears messy because it cannot be fully controlled. Love does not follow a script. It unfolds through tension, uncertainty, and adaptation. This is why love is often accompanied by fear. Fear is not the opposite of love, but a byproduct of its power. To care deeply is to accept the possibility of loss. The psyche responds to this possibility with heightened alertness. Emotional intensity increases, and with it, the likelihood of disruption. What is threatened feels alive. What is safe feels distant. Comfort can exist without engagement. Love demands participation. It calls for presence, reflection, and change. The disruption it creates is not meant to destroy stability, but to replace false stability with something more authentic. Stability built on avoidance cannot coexist with love for long. Importantly, disruption does not mean dysfunction. While love may unsettle, it also clarifies, strips away illusions, and reveals what truly matters. Through discomfort, it offers an opportunity for integration. The individual is invited to reconcile opposing needs, to balance vulnerability with strength, and to align behavior with genuine feeling. Love reveals itself and OT in how calm everything remains, but in how deeply it affects the inner world. When comfort is disturbed, when certainty gives way to reflection, and when emotional equilibrium is challenged, is often because love has entered the psyche and begun its work of transformation. The psyche is not a static structure. It is the living system, constantly adjusting, compensating, and reorganizing itself in response to internal and external pressures. At its core lies a fundamental drive toward equilibrium. Whenever imbalance arises, the psyche mobilizes forces to restore harmony, often in ways that bypass conscious intention. This process operates continuously, shaping emotions, thoughts, and behavior with the aim of preserving psychological stability. Balance is essential for psychological survival. When a person lives too rigidly in one mode of being, too controlled, too detached, too compliant, or too dominant, the psyche generates compensatory responses. These responses appear as sudden emotional shifts, unexpected desires, dreams, or impulses. They are not random, they are corrective. The psyche seeks to offset excess by activating its opposite. This compensatory function becomes most visible during periods of prolonged repression, when emotions, needs, or instincts are consistently suppressed. Psychic tension accumulates. The unconscious absorbs what the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. Over time, this accumulation demands release. The psyche then produces symptoms, emotional eruptions, or behavioral changes that restore psychological flow. For example, excessive rationality often produces irrational emotional outbursts. Chronic self-sacrifice may lead to resentment, anti or burnout. Extreme independence may generate sudden longing for closeness. These shifts are not contradictions. They are attempts by the psyche to re-establish internal balance by activating neglected dimensions of experience. The psyche does not seek comfort, it seeks wholeness. Comfort can coexist with imbalance, but wholeness cannot. When an individual avoids conflict, vulnerability, or introspection, imbalance grows beneath the surface. The psyche compensates by creating situations that force engagement with what has been avoided. In this way, emotional crises often function as corrective mechanisms rather than mere disruptions. Dreams offer a clear illustration of this balancing process. When waking life becomes one-sided, dreams present contrasting imagery. A person overly identified with control may dream of chaos. Someone emotionally detached may dream of intense intimacy. These symbolic experiences aim to restore equilibrium by reintroducing neglected psychological elements. Balance also governs relationships. When one partner dominates emotionally, the other may unconsciously withdraw. When one suppresses their needs, the other may become overly expressive. These relational dynamics reflect the psyche's effort to maintain symmetry. Even conflict can serve this purpose, forcing hidden tensions into awareness where they can be addressed. Psychological symptoms often arise when balance cannot be achieved through conscious means. Anxiety, depression, compulsions, and mood swings may appear when inner conflicts remain unresolved. Rather than viewing these symptoms as failures, they can be understood as the psyche's attempt to signal imbalance and initiate core active change. The psyche also regulates identity. When a person becomes overly attached to a single self-image, inner contradiction intensifies. A persona built exclusively around strength may produce vulnerability. A self-image rooted in kindness may generate anger. These emerging traits are not flaws, but necessary counterweights that prevent psychological rigidity. Importantly, balance does not mean neutrality. It does not imply the absence of tension, but the presence of dynamic equilibrium. The psyche thrives in movement, not stasis. It oscillates between opposing forces, activity and rest, closeness and distance, autonomy and connection, to maintain psychological vitality. Resistance to this process often intensifies imbalance. When individuals deny emerging emotions or suppress corrective impulses, the psyche increases their intensity. What begins as subtle discomfort becomes persistent anxiety or disruptive behavior. The more one resists internal adjustment, the more forcefully the psyche intervenes. This is why life transitions often feel destabilizing. Changes in relationships, identity or purpose disturb established patterns. The psyche responds by generating emotional turbulence, confusion, or longing. These experiences are not signs of weakness, but indicators that internal reorganization is underway. Ultimately, the psyche's drive toward balance serves growth. It ensures that no single aspect of identity becomes tyrannical. It integrates contradiction, complexity, and change into a coherent inner system. Through compensation and correction, the psyche guides individuals toward greater psychological wholeness, even when the path feels disorienting or unsettling.